Good afternoon. Welcome to the foundation of the Energy Law Journal's author talk, The Precipice of Justice, Equity, Energy, and the Environment in Indian Country and Rural Communities. My name is Sylvia Bartel, and I am the president of FELJ. It is my honor to welcome our panelists and authors, Anne Eisenberg and Elizabeth Cronk Warner, as well as our moderator, Kat Gamache. This article highlights important and timely issues on the subjects of energy, climate, and environmental justice. We look forward to the audience participation in the Q&A section of this program, particularly from our colleagues at FERC in the Office of Public Participation. I would like to emphasize that this article and author talk share the goal of prompting in-depth contributions from authors in future editions of the journal. As always, we welcome submissions on this topic and other energy law issues. With that, I will turn it over to our moderator.
Hi, thank you. This is Kat Gamache, the executive editor of the Energy Law Journal, and thank you all for tuning in. I'm really excited about this topic, and one of the reasons why I am so excited is because this essay has generated a lot of dialogue. As the authors note in this essay, it is an essay rather than an article, and that is because it is not designed to be a fulsome legal analysis. Rather, it raises issues for further discussion. And as the authors conclude, we are on a precipice of justice, but it's really not clear whether or not we'll get there. This topic raises some controversy, and I just want to remind you that this is a safe space and no questions are dumb, and also no questions should be read into or the motivations attributed to the asker. And so if you do have questions, we will have some time designated at the end, but also feel free to send them into the Q&A box throughout, and we will try to sneak them in as possible. So we go into these with knowing that some of you have thoroughly examined the materials and some of you have not. And so we try to strike a balance. And the balance here, the authors decided to prepare a presentation. And so we will launch into that before getting into the questions. And Dean, I believe that you are first. So if you would like to put your slides up, we'll get started.
Great, thank you so much, Kat. And let me get my slides up and going. All right, Kat, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, hello and welcome everyone. I appreciate you spending an hour of your time with us today. As was mentioned, my name is Elizabeth Cronk Warner. I have the privilege of being Dean at the S.J. Quinney College of Law, and I'm also a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. And today I'm also repping my University of Kansas gear in support of the men's basketball team who's playing for the championship today. Prior to working at the University of Utah, I used to work at the University of Kansas. So Rock Chalk Jayhawk. My pronouns are she and hers, and as I like to do anytime that I am presenting, I do want to acknowledge that the land that I'm on today, which is in the Salt Lake Valley, is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many Indigenous peoples and traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. So it seems really relevant that we should be here today as part of kind of this community outreach activity to talk about this important issue of energy development and how it intersects with Indian country. I want to thank Harvey Ryder for inviting myself and Professor Eisenberg for writing the article and for participating. in today's webinar, and then also to Kat Gamache for moderating today's discussion. I'm really looking forward to it. As the title slide mentions, my focus is Indian country, and as was mentioned before, we wrote an essay. Really, the purpose of the essay was to present 2 case studies and how these issues of environmental justice, energy justice, climate justice all intersect within different communities to really show us the precipice of justice, right? The possibility of justice, but issues that we need to work through in order to accomplish that. So I'm going to be talking about Indian country today, and then Professor Eisenberg will be talking about rural America. And obviously there's some intersection there because many tribal communities are located in rural communities as well, although as we see as we go through these presentations, the law is a little bit different as it applies in Indian country versus as it applies in other rural parts of the United States. All right, so next, just an introduction to my presentation. So I'm going to talk about some foundational principles that will really set up today's discussion. Then we'll talk about how justice just looks different in Indian country. So again, kind of drawing that comparison and contrasting to other parts of the country, such as rural America. And then last, but certainly not least, we'll talk about some of the obstacles to effective energy justice and development in Indian country. And then we'll also talk about some opportunities, and in particular, how some tribes are really paving the way and showing that the obstacles that we'll talk about can and have been overcome in certain instances. So first, let's talk about kind of those foundational principles. So what is Indian country? I use that term with its legal meaning. So Indian country is defined at 18 U.S.C. 1151, and it's inclusive of both reservations, allotments, and domestic Indian communities. And hopefully most of you are familiar with reservations, but as I mentioned, it also includes allotments and domestic Indian communities. So what are those 2 things? Allotments goes back to the 19th century policy of allotment, where many tribal community land holdings were divided and given out to male members of the tribes, and then the surplus, which depending on who you talk to was 2/3 to 80% of the land, was given to non-natives. And so as a result, many tribes that were impacted by allotment acts find that they are checkerboarded, where you can have different ownership of allotments throughout the reservation. And that's really relevant to our discussion of energy because you could have different land ownership based on who owns the particular land. And different land statuses include everything from tribal ownership, individual Indian ownership, ownership by the federal government, as we'll talk about later in my presentation, to ownership by non-Indians. And certainly that's going to impact energy development based on who is the owner of the land. And because there were these allotments, you could have allotments that are very far away from reservations. So for example, the Turtle Mountain Nation, which is located within North Dakota, has allotments in Montana, even though its reservation is in North Dakota. So the allotments are not necessarily contiguous with the actual reservation land. And then what are dependent Indian communities? So dependent Indian communities was a category that was created to discuss or represent some Native communities that had a different tradition. And so a dependent Indian community exists where land has been set aside by the federal government for the use and enjoyment of a tribe. And is still under the management of the federal government. So if that definition is met, then you also potentially have a dependent Indian community, even though you might not have a reservation. So when I use the term Indian country, I'm using that to be inclusive of all those different types of land holdings within the United States, as different tribal communities have different land holdings. And so I want to be inclusive. And as I mentioned, this is one of 2 case studies that we are presenting to you today to really generate this discussion of how do we do energy development in a way that's consistent with all the principles of justice, principles of energy justice, climate justice, and environmental justice. So you may be asking, well, gosh, that's a lot of justice. What do each one of those principles mean? So first, energy justice. So energy justice seeks to refine and expand our legal understanding of how we plan for, invest in, and regulate energy to be cost beneficial for international governance, nations, and societies. Energy justice examines and promotes a global energy system that is safe, reliable, just, reasonable, and also sustainable for current and future generations. And that temporal intergenerational concept is really important to these ideas of justice. It's not just current generations, but it's also future generations, which also intersects very nicely with not all, but many Native communities that talk about intergenerational justice. And sometimes you might hear, for example, tribes thinking of in terms of 7 generations, which for some tribes means that we think about how our decisions impact out to 7 generations. And for some tribes, it means that we situate ourselves within the 7 generations. So we're the middle, and we think about the 3 generations behind us. So our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. And then we think about the 3 generations in front of us. So our kids, our grandchildren, and then our great-grandchildren. And so different tribes think about it in different ways, but the point is all the same, that there's this concept of intergenerational justice, which is definitely incorporated into energy justice. Importantly, energy justice also considers the needs for energy path forward that is restorative, minimizes or reverses the cumulative impacts of the energy system, and engages in energy consumers in decision-making processes. And that's going to become important too in Indian country, because we're going to come back later in my presentation to talk a little bit about this idea of consultation and what that means and what that should mean rather in Indian country. Okay, so that's energy justice. What about climate justice? When I talk about climate justice, I'm using the term, and I'm reading now from our article. So if you want to go and find these ideas of justice, I definitely recommend our article to you. But when we use the term climate justice, we're talking about the call for equity for those who are disproportionately impacted by climate change. So I'll give you an example coming from Indian country. So we're already starting to see broad effects of climate change in Alaska, for example. And many tribes and native villages, as exist in Alaska, are legally tied to certain land. So they certainly could leave the land, but if they were to leave the land, then they lose all of their legal protections. Also, many tribal communities and native communities have cultural and spiritual connections to the land. So there's a lot of reasons why native and indigenous cultures might be connected to a certain piece of land. And what we're seeing is that because of climate change, a couple of things are happening in Alaska. We're seeing migratory paths of certain animals that many native communities relied on, such as caribou, moving, which means that it's getting harder and harder to hunt. And also we're seeing melting of permafrost and melting of the snow in areas that we've never seen before, at least not in recent memory have seen. And that's causing big disasters for the land purposes. So that's an example of a disproportionate impact of climate change, because many of these native communities in Alaska contribute little, if anything, to climate change. And then last but not least, what do I mean about environmental justice? So environmental justice asks whether vulnerable communities and communities of color are asked to disproportionately bear the impacts of climate or of environmental pollution, excuse me. It's rooted in the concept of environmental racism. And this movement in the United States forged a pivotal connection among concerns for social justice, civil rights, and environmental protection. So those are the concepts that we're going to look at in our presentation today. And basically what we're doing is we're using these case studies. Again, I'm focusing on Indian country, and Professor Eisenberg will focus on rural America in one moment, to show how these concepts interact with one another. Arguably, the energy sector contributes to climate change more than any other industry. Climate change is predicted to affect environmental justice communities the most. I gave you an example earlier, and the energy sector has a long history with environmental injustice. So for example, specifically citing coal-fired power plants in communities that were disproportionately poor, communities of color, because those communities were not in a position to effectively fight against the siting of those coal-powered generating plants. So as our article title suggests, we do believe that justice is possible, but we need to remain seized. And certainly in this first year of the Biden administration, we've seen some moving forward on those concepts. We've seen a lot of discussion in many of the energy related regulations that specifically talks about environmental justice and environmental justice communities. But if we really are to see justice, then we have to remain seized on this concept and have it front and center. Also, we have to see that environmental justice communities really see the benefit of change. And so I use uranium mining in Navajo Nation as an example of this. You may be familiar with kind of the sad history of uranium mining in Navajo Nation, where the tribe faced extensive uranium extraction and was extensively impacted by that extraction because it caused a lot of cancer and other health effects in the community. But of course, that uranium was not going back to the community in order to meet energy needs in the community, but was rather being used elsewhere. So that's kind of your classic example of an environmental justice concern where the community, the Navajo Nation, was bearing all of the negative externalities and negative impacts of the uranium mining, but yet was not bearing the benefits of that production. And so that's something that we'll want to remain seized on and we'll want to work on moving forward. Okay, so now digging a little bit more into Indian country and the unique considerations in Indian country, there are 5 unique considerations that I want to point out that if we're truly to have energy justice, climate justice, and environmental justice, we must take these considerations into mind when looking at energy development within Indian country. So the first, and I deliberately put it first, is tribal sovereignty. So some folks are surprised to hear that tribes are separate sovereigns. So tribal nations pre-existed the formation of the federal government. And in fact, if you look at the Constitution, the framers viewed tribes as separate sovereigns. You can see that represented in the Constitution because the Constitution only talks about tribes in a couple places. So for example, the president has the ability to enter into treaties with tribes, and Congress has the ability to regulate commerce with tribes. And that's really indicative of the framers' understanding that tribes were separate nations. Their sovereignty exists both on territoriality and the membership of their citizens. So how does this play out, this idea of tribal sovereignty within Indian country? And this kind of relates right back into our consultation. So we need to treat tribes, and tribes must be treated as separate sovereigns. They're not just another community stakeholder. They have rights and obligations both from the federal government, in some instances the state government, and so therefore those rights and obligations must be met. And it's really going to come into play moving to our second point. So tribal consultation. So oftentimes we have, and it's still the role today. I would encourage you, I wrote an article on what consultation should look like. It's called Changing Consultation, and it's in the UC Davis Law Review if you're interested. But a lot of provisions say that we should have conservation, especially in the energy area, but very, very few regulations actually spell out what that consultation must look like. So for example, FERC now has the Office of Public Participation, and it talks about having collaboration, which will better ensure the concerns of tribal members and environmental justice communities, but that's not specifically spelled out. So how do we have effective consultation? And this oftentimes raises difficult questions around who should the entity consult with, what should consultation look like, how should that move forward? And I can give you definitely an example of what not to do kind of in the energy sector, and that's the Dakota Access Pipeline example from 2016, 2017. You may recall that that ended up in having thousands upon thousands camped out right outside the lake because the tribes were very concerned about the federal government giving permission for the permit underneath the lake to allow for the completion of an oil pipeline. And I think that's a good example of where the relevant agencies failed in their consultation. Now at trial, they gave numerous instances of where they emailed tribal representatives or they sent a letter to tribal representatives. But that's just not effective method. And also I always mentioned, you know, if the United States were negotiating with France, that's not how we would treat France, right? And so similarly, you need to have oftentimes face-to-face negotiation with the tribe and reach out to the tribe to ask for the tribe's direction and how that consultation should take place. Now, admittedly, that can take some time to do that outreach, but it's really important to avoid the downstream effects of what happens when consultation is not effective. And that leads us into the federal trust relationship. So I mentioned earlier that because tribes are separate sovereigns, there are these obligations, and an important one is the federal trust relationship. And the federal trust relationship is the relationship that exists between the federal government and tribes. Specifically, that the federal government has undertaken both a moral obligation and in many instances an enforceable obligation to protect and act in the best interests of tribes. So in general, courts have recognized this broad moral obligation that the federal government has to always act in the best interest of tribes. And in many instances, that becomes an enforceable binding obligation where the federal government has explicitly agreed to take on an obligation. So for example, where you have a statute or a regulation that specifically calls for the federal government to act in a certain way to the benefit of tribes, then you have an enforceable binding federal trust relationship in that particular instance. And so any federal officer or entity working in Indian country must be aware of course, the general obligation to act in the best interest, and then absolutely must be aware of any enforceable binding trust relationship that must exist. Next, in order to effectively work and have environmental, energy, and climate justice in Indian country, we have to be aware of the relationship that many tribes, not all, I don't want to perpetuate the stereotype of the environmental steward, but for many of us, we do have a special relationship to our environment, and as a result, special environmental ethics of our communities. So I'll give you an example. So in my tribe, the Sioux State Marine Tribe of Chippewa Indians, we have summer ceremonies. And in order to participate in those summer ceremonies, we have to go back to the land of our reservation. Unlike other traditions and customs and religions where you can practice that wherever you may be, for many of us in Indian country, we are very much tied to a specific area of land. And so that land takes on important characteristics. And of course, anytime we're talking about energy development or energy extraction, we want to be very much aware of what those differences is. And similarly, we might see different tribal environmental ethics coming up in those communities as a result of this connection to place. So for example, we're starting to see that. You may have seen that it made the news in terms of tribes explicitly recognizing rights of nature. And unlike other communities that have recognized rights of nature, there's no argument about the validity of the rights of nature. The arguments in the courts these days is how far that extends. So again, definitely something to keep in mind for companies who may be working in Indian country. And last but not least, while not necessarily legally binding, I do think it's important to take the historical context into consideration. So going back again to our example of the Dakota Access Pipeline, you really have to put that controversy into its historical context, where the tribes at issue there had been removed to a territory that was not necessarily their choosing. Their original homelands had been shrunken and shrunken and shrunken. Their land had been flooded over time. Their people had been massacred over the ghost dance. And so this pipeline was just one more indignity along centuries of indignities that have been forced upon that particular community. And so it's really going to amplify concerns from the federal government. And also something to keep in consideration when you're going into a new tribal community is that there is that history and history of distrust. And so again, oftentimes that face-to-face is going to be very important to overcome those historical indignities. So what are some of the obstacles to development, and especially renewal development in Indian country? So first is incentives. Oftentimes a lot of projects happening elsewhere are funded in large part through tax incentives and other sorts of incentives from the state and the federal government. And tribes are simply not eligible for that because as a government, they don't pay taxes. And so therefore they don't have the access to those incentives. And so sometimes that can make energy a bit less attractive to a third-party investor working in Indian country. Next is location. Many of our tribal communities with large renewable resources, for example, such as wind, are located significantly away from large population bases, which means that there has to be a large investment of infrastructure in order for energy development to make sense in those places, which of course, again, is going to be an obstacle to that effective development. And last but not least, timeliness of the development. For many tribes, the federal government has a property interest in the land, because this goes back to that 1823 Johnson v. McIntosh case, which if you think back, might have been the first case that you had in property, where the federal government basically held that the federal government had the actual fee simple absolute interest in the land, but the tribes had the right of beneficial interest. So anytime that you have the federal government as a landholder, things are necessarily just going to move more slowly, because you're going to bring them in, and there are of course certain regulations that must be followed. So as a result, there are difficulties to energy development, but some tribes are overcoming those difficulties, and they are making progress, switching to new and different forms of energy and clean energy, although many tribes still are engaged in traditional extractive industries, such as coal removal. But some examples of the switch to clean energy include the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, which built a solar farm that produces enough energy to power 2 large community buildings. And do note that while that's wonderful for the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, that community is significantly far from large population centers. So you'll see that the focus here is on powering its own community. Similarly, the Winnebago tribe has installed solar panels on every building within its reservation. Again, good for that community, but perhaps not helpful for large scale energy development. And last but not least, the Navajo Nation has been engaged in several different projects, from solar projects, and also specifically through solar energy to hydroelectric turbines, to divert water from the Colorado River. So tribes are looking at different strategies, and they certainly have their benefits and disadvantages. You won't see here large scale energy production that's owned by tribes, and that's because of some of the obstacles that we have discussed. So it's been somewhat limited, but with that, I will end on a positive note and turn it over to Professor Eisenberg to talk about rural America.
Thank you so much. Well, Professor Eisenberg is putting her slides up. Dean, I do have one question that I think would fit in here. You mentioned the consultation process and how it's key to talk face-to-face. And if we were negotiating with France, we would do that. How do we know who to reach out to? And do we need to do this with every tribe? And how do we determine which tribes are relevant to a particular project?
So yes, you need to do it with every tribe, because every tribe is a separate sovereign nation. Of course, and I should say those that are recognized as such, there's a listing, an annual listing in the Federal Registrar of over 570 tribes. So I would say start there to see where the tribes are in your region. The National Congress of American Indians has a wonderful database of contacts and who to reach out to at the individual tribes. And if for some reason the National Congress of American Indians can't help you, also the Bureau of Indian Affairs is a wonderful resource as well. So I would say reach out there, figure out who the tribes are in the area through the Federal Register, and then reach out to either the National Congress of American Indians or the Bureau of Indian Affairs to ascertain that contact information. And then Kat, what was the third piece?
I think you caught them all, actually.
Oh, okay.
How do we know who to reach out to? Does it have to be with every tribe? You said yes. Yeah.
Okay,
that
well,
covered
great.
it.
Yeah, and think about that. Sometimes people bristle because of the added parties to add to consultation, but remember, you're avoiding billions and billions of dollars of litigation expenses and lost profit in terms of the time it takes to get those projects to completion when the tribes challenge you. So it's well worth the initial investment up front. Professor Eisenberg?
Thank you.
Okay, hello everybody. I hope y'all are doing well this afternoon. I want to echo the Dean's thanks to the folks at the Energy Law Journal for the opportunity to contribute this piece and to speak with everybody today. So my name is Ann Eisenberg. I'm an associate professor at the University of South Carolina School of Law. I failed to wear my school gear today, but I've got to give a shout out to the women's basketball team for securing the national championship last night. Woohoo. And yeah, I'm going to continue this important conversation about the many forms of justice and injustice that are implicated in energy development. And I am going to turn our focus just for the next few minutes. I'll try to stay brief so we can get to the Q&A. But I'm going to talk about rural communities' role in this conundrum. And so just a little bit about me. I think this background is kind of relevant to understanding why I got interested in this topic and my perspective on it. The seeds of my interest in coal-reliant communities were planted when I lived and worked in West Virginia from 2014 to 2016 in the Land Use and Sustainable Development Law Clinic at WVU Law. And one of the things that amazing clinic does is get out into coal country and neighboring areas in West Virginia to provide technical assistance to small local governments who are trying to figure out what their futures are going to look like beyond coal and sometimes beyond natural gas. And so those 2 years living and working in West Virginia were really eye-opening for me, just seeing what the legacy of coal and environmental injustice looked like, but then also this conundrum of economic reliance on hazardous industries in these geographically isolated, population sparse regions, and what can possibly be done about it. I've continued kind of adjacent work as a practitioner in the environmental law clinic that I started at the University of South Carolina School of Law. And I've been simultaneously exploring this scholarly interest in rural communities and their coal reliance as part of the bigger question that a lot of attention to has turned to today of rural economic decline in general and approaches to rural revitalization. And so that's kind of how my portion of this essay is framed a little bit, looking at the coal transition and transition policies for coal-reliant communities as part of or a subset of these questions of rural revitalization. So I've kind of been pondering this question of how different in terms of a loss of an economic rural activity is coal, and how much is coal part of this broader story of rural economic decline? So the question kind of being, is coal truly an energy conversation? And it obviously very much is, but could we also look at it as being like timber, or being like manufacturing jobs, or being like agricultural consolidation, and the many parallel different avenues in which rural communities have lost these traditional livelihoods and are having to kind of rethink what the rural future looks like. Both of these topics are difficult and complicated, and I encounter a lot of pessimism where folks saying like, wow, that transitioning away from coal and coal reliance and revitalizing rural America both seem like such huge, impossible tasks. Can we really do it? Can we really do either of those effectively? My take on this, just to not bury the lead here, is that there is no silver bullet to either of these questions. But to borrow a phrase I heard someone say at a conference once that I really liked, there's no silver bullet, but there is silver buckshot. And so some of the policies I'm going to talk about over the next few minutes, I think represent what the pieces of a holistic, multifaceted approach probably look like to tackling both of these difficult issues. So something to watch right now definitely is the Colorado Office of Just Transition. The dean was speaking earlier about the different types of justice. So when I was in West Virginia, yet another type of justice having to do with energy that really caught my interest is this idea of the just transition. This is a contested idea. There are a lot of different definitions of this idea, but I would say one of the most commonly understood definitions of this idea of justice in energy is the idea that for all those workers and communities and regions who have that economic dependence, it would be unfair to just pull the rug out from under them. So it's adding another wrinkle of complexity to decarbonization, because there are all these folks who stand to lose their livelihoods and way of life as we decarbonize. So the idea of just transition refers to some kind of fairness, some kind of replacement of that economic activity or some kind of intervention to make sure that communities aren't just having the rug pulled out. So this initiative in Colorado is an exciting model to try to tackle this need to not just decarbonize, but to kind of restructure the economy and to re-envision an entire region toward a different kind of economy. So to my knowledge, this is the first of its kind, a state agency devoted to just transition. That's in the Colorado Department of Labor. The state legislature created it in 2019. What's interesting and neat about this office and kind of the policies enabling it and that it's implementing, it's really not just about lost jobs and job replacement. It's taking into account the many diverse forms of equity, environmental justice, energy justice, climate justice, and labor justice in the policies that it's working with to addressing this issue of losing coal as an economic activity. So the office created a statewide plan. It does have aspects of job creation in it, trying to find new livelihoods for displaced workers, but it's also thinking about community economic development more broadly, looking to create a broader property tax base, looking to pursue economic diversification so this doesn't happen again. And then trying also to keep energy costs down as new forms of renewable energy could saddle ratepayers with novel energy costs for a variety of reasons. So really taking a holistic view of the many justices implicated in energy transitions here. Another exciting model that is getting a lot of attention as trying to tackle this complex issue from the many different angles that it requires is the New Mexico Energy Transition Act of 2019. So oftentimes this law and laws similar to it get attention for their aggressive efforts to reduce carbon emissions and commit to clean energy targets within kind of an ambitiously quick time period. And the law certainly is framed around renewable energy targets, but this law also includes workforce training. It also includes economic transition assistance to communities that are losing coal. It also includes efforts at economic diversification. And it also includes pipeline programs for green jobs to ensure that the wealth and livelihood opportunities in clean energy jobs are not just available to the demographics, namely white men who have historically enjoyed the most benefits from energy jobs, but to ensure equitable access to those opportunities as well. So I find both the Colorado initiative and the New Mexico one to be really interesting and exciting because it's taking they're both taking multiple factors into account in transitioning away from coal. These are not narrow interventions. They're looking at the issue from the angles of labor justice, energy justice, environmental justice, and rural community economic development, which seems necessary in the face of such a complex issue that has also had so many historic inequities associated with it. So one interesting thing about the Colorado initiative is Colorado's plan actually calls out the federal government. for saying, we really need federal leadership on the task of transitioning away from coal. And there really hasn't been any. And so that's another question that I think is interesting and important with this dilemma of how are we going to do this as a nation. And so we do see, we have seen this sort of massive recent federal intervention into rural economic marginalization generally, which was very exciting for those of us in the field. And the question is, do we need something like this specifically for transitions away from coal and maybe more broadly from transitions away from fossil fuels? So just to quickly address the aspects of the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, this did not get so much mainstream attention for being a rural policy. This was the law that was passed to address for the most part, the pandemic, the economic fallout of the pandemic. So it was, don't recall, it involved direct payments to households, extending unemployment insurance eligibility, and expanding food, childcare, and rental assistance. So really social safety net initiatives there. But it also included in something that we haven't seen in decades, that those of us who sort of do writing and advocacy in this space, some specific rural appropriations that were really kind of a big deal for addressing rural declines in economic activity, rural population decline, and the associated decline in rural infrastructure. So appropriations for rural healthcare providers, broadband expansion, food access, support for farmers of color, and an expansion of the Indian housing and Indian community development block programs. And so the question I'm kind of toying with right now is, do we need federal leadership like this that is specific to coal-reliant communities or fossil fuel-reliant communities, or the energy shift more broadly? Or should it be left to the states who, as we can see with Colorado and New Mexico, are doing really interesting, creative, and important things to take this on? So I will stop there in the interest of moving on to the Q&A, but I want to thank everyone so much for being here today.
Thanks so much. Well, I am really delighted to say that we have in our audience Katz, who is the head of the Office of Public Participation at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And we want to give her a few moments to tell us a little bit about what her office is doing on this. So Olivia, if you could unmute Katz.
Hi, I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Ellen Katz. I am the new director of FERC's Office of Public Participation, which was stood up in mid-2021, and I came in just before Thanksgiving. And thank you all for your presentations. Very, very thought-provoking. There's a lot to it. So just in the context of what OPP is doing, we are working to facilitate better public participation into FERC processes, more transparency, greater understanding, greater educational materials, and hopefully just changes in the process to make things more transparent and to make it easier for members of the public to participate and bring their voice into FERC proceedings. And this is a very relevant conversation because we are particularly focused on environmental justice communities, landowners, Indian tribal constituents, and consumer advocates and other organizations. So I just want to make one clarification though on the tribal engagements. We work with individual tribal members and constituents, and I've had a call recently with some representatives of tribal energy companies. But you guys are absolutely correct that the engagement when it comes to the sovereign, the heads of the governments of the nations needs to be from a consultative role, government to government, so to speak. And so that effort at FERC is being led by the Office of External Affairs, which handles, just as they would handle engagements with Canada, they are handling engagements with the sovereign governments of the tribal nations. So just to make that clarification. And just a comment, we are very much trying to build relationships. We're on a listening tour right now. We will soon be moving into another phase of outreach where we will, hopefully as COVID protocols scale back, be able to not just do virtual events, but go to the communities. I think, as was noted by both speakers, it's very important to bring the government to the people, to meet people where they are, to understand their situations. And so I look forward to doing that. And just one comment on the Dakota Access Pipeline. I'm the former consumer advocate from the state of Connecticut, and I was also president of the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates, which is the national organization. And I had very much followed the Dakota Access Pipeline, and at one point had spoken with one of the commissioners in one of the states that had jurisdiction over it. And he was very angry about the way it went down. And he had said to me, or to a group of us, they never came to see us. They never came before us. They never did this, sort of similar along the lines of what Elizabeth had mentioned. And it always stuck with me to look deeper into why. Did they not feel, did they not know the avenues that were available to them? Did they not trust them? Did they feel like going sort of outside of the process was the best way to get results? And that's actually part of what attracted me to this position at FERC, because I think it is important for us to understand the perspective of those who feel left out of the process, and not just assume that we know the answers, but to understand their perspectives and to try to meet them and meet their needs. So it's very interesting to hear you talk about the Dakota Access Pipeline. And I won't take up any more time other than to say that if folks need help, we are available. We have a phone line and an email inbox, and we answer every single contact. And you can also reach out to me directly, lnelin.katz@ferc.gov. I'll put it in the chat. And I really appreciate the comments and this great discussion.
Thank you so much. We totally put you on the spot and really appreciate that. Elin raised a question that I actually wanted to follow up on to Dean, and that was, in the article, there's a statement that says, if the tribe is not involved, then you should not build the project. And that really struck me because, again, I think to the point that Elin was making, you really need to understand the perspectives. And just to clarify, I mean, I guess, is it that you can't just assume that everything's fine if they're not engaged, whereas that's typically what you would assume with another landowner that has been notified about the process. Could you provide any clarification on that or perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously the important distinction between an individual landowner and a tribe is that tribes are separate sovereign nations. And so in response to, kind of the question posed of, do they not understand the resources and stuff, tribes are aware of the processes. It's just not the appropriate process to engage another sovereign, right? So in the Dakota Access Pipeline example, letters were sent getting notice under the regional nationwide permit, but that's not how you would typically engage another sovereign. And so a lot of tribes will take the position that they're not going to respond to inappropriate engagement. So definitely silence does not mean acquiescence. And so then, it just kind of goes back to, I guess, what will be my theme for my presentation is, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound in the sense of doing the actual outreach. Really does go far. And I recognize and respect that obviously in the past 2 years, that's been complicated by COVID. And we've had to do some things virtually, but now that hopefully, knock on wood, things are getting better, and I really hope that Omicron 2 is not coming here. Hopefully we can get back on the road and just have those face-to-face meetings and that initial consultation with tribes of how do you want to consult? What is, we recognize your sovereignty. We recognize that you play an important role in this. What is the effective method of consultation with you? Again, I acknowledge and recognize and respect that that takes more time up front, but it's just going to create things so much more easily on the back end. And there are some good examples of that. There's, so in Montana, there's a platinum mine that went into place. I'm of course completely blanking on the name right now, but they did a great job of doing outreach to the local tribes, and we're able to address the tribe's concerns through an MOU. Similarly, we've seen some gas lines down south that have done effective tribal consultation, and we did not see what happened with Dakota Access. So do acknowledge that it takes more time up front, but it'll just make things a lot easier on the back end.
Great. And I should just, as a reminder, say if you do have any questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A, or you can also raise your hand and Olivia will unmute you and you can speak live. Back to the issue of perspectives, which is, I think, one of the key issues here. Who determines what is just in all of your research? I've heard in the article, there is, well, if they're bearing the burden of CO2, but they're not getting any benefit. But what if they are getting a benefit? But then there's also, well, we can't pull the rug out from under them. And I guess who determines what is just, and what sort of controversy or pushback are you two experiencing on this?
Sure. Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, I suspect that a bit of the tone of our essay is that we're trying to say that affected communities in sort of development projects have a strong sense of what is just. I think justice is an inherently subjective concept, and maybe that is part of the tension here, is that an agency or a decision maker might have an idea of justice. Oh, what we did was fair. And then the local community has a strong sense of injustice. And so it seems like procedural justice, if I may add another one, or at least procedural inclusion, or erring on the side of listening rather than assuming, can be key to kind of working toward a consensus on a definition of justice. The pushback I've gotten that I think, again, has been alluded to in this conversation is, well, if you listen more, you might have to change outcomes or how you do things. And what if they, the stakeholders that we're listening to are wrong? And so I think this raises some, really fundamental questions about technical expertise versus democracy, versus kind of pragmatic considerations as well. And so that's just my 2 cents in response to that.
Yeah, and I would just add in and jump in that, yeah, I completely agree with kind of the theme of empowering communities and creating processes for communities to participate, as Professor Eisenberg was saying. And would just add on, I do acknowledge that there's kind of this added layer of complexity in Indian country, because it is not uncommon to have a government who might say, okay, let's go ahead and move forward with this project, but then have either organizations or individual members of that community say, oh, wait a second. And so that's where I think it's going back to Ellen Katz's point, which is lovely. I love hearing that FERC has both the external outreach and her organization, which is more focused on the individual and allowing for engagement in both places, because then theoretically you're engaging the tribe, the government, on a government to government basis, but also creating space for individual members of the tribe to disagree, because just like every other country, we have individual citizens who will disagree with what their government is doing. And so it's nice to have processes for all to engage.
I have a question here for Professor Eisenberg. Is anyone connecting replacement of coal jobs with non-energy jobs through the reshoring of other areas of manufacturing, as has been discussed by the Biden administration?
That is a really good question. I would say I have not actually heard about the Biden administration's interest in manufacturing to replace coal jobs, but I think the conversation on how to replace coal jobs is definitely evolving. A few years ago, it was very much, how do you replace coal jobs with clean energy jobs? And then, it's emerged that that is in fact quite a complicated, even just replacing coal with, say, solar or wind. There's so much complexity to that it's clearly not going to be a one-to-one. Energy jobs are not a cure-all. And so I think that's why this idea of locally driven economic diversification that's federally and state supported is sort of maybe has some of the answers here, where there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all new economic activity that replaces this. Each area and locality and region is going to be finding its own way, but they need support to do that. So that's kind of my understanding of the state of that conversation.
That's actually, yeah, that's a really good question. And not something I had thought about. I had always thought about it sort of energy to energy, but of course we can think outside the box there.
And I'll just jump on that just to add in Indian country. That's been a common critique when clean energy comes in and argues that jobs are going to be created, but oftentimes the tribal communities say, yeah, but not for our folks, because they tend to be very highly credentialed job opportunities that for many, not all of the communities, I don't want to create a stereotype, but just might not be accessible. So that's a really good point that Professor Eisenberg's making.
Yeah, I mean, we could really use some more EPC contractors and some domestic solar panels right now. Okay, so Professor Eisenberg, back to you. The article said that many rural appropriations dollars end up in the hands of large-scale agricultural producers that offer little benefit to local communities. Can you expand on this?
Yeah, so I think there's quite a few things packed into that sentence. So one is the question of, I often refer to rural communities, but that is sort of a very broad category. Rural communities have inequality within them, and they have power dynamics within them. One of the challenges I think you see, and I think you see this with rural communities and other kinds of marginalized communities as well, that when there is a resource, even if it's designed for a particular marginalized population, actually getting the resource can be a challenge in and of itself because of the need for technical expertise. Even things like filling out just big, lengthy, burdensome technical applications can be a barrier. So I saw some grant programs in West Virginia offering, people were bidding for technical assistance to get the aid, sort of like a grant application assistance kind of, right? And so I think there are sort of, as has historically been the case with kind of coal versus the places where that industry has been at times, and in certain places, industrialized agriculture is often a big player who my understanding is benefits from a fair amount of federal dollars. And so you can, from the outside, I think urban and suburban folks can get the impression, well, a lot of dollars are flowing to rural communities, but they're flowing to kind of a concentrated corporate entity that's sort of at the top and a bit apart from what I would define as the community, if that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So it's not just putting the money out there, it's also making sure it's accessible to the rural communities.
Exactly.
Okay. looking at the difficulties in transitioning from coal jobs and the economic devastation for those communities, what safeguards can be put in place now in seeking to transition oil and gas jobs to renewable energy jobs? Interesting.
Dean,
Probably should start thinking about
that. Do you want to jump in on that one? I imagine that's there's some overlap there.
I guess I would say they're already starting. So maybe they are seeing what is going on with coal country. I mean, I'm here in Houston and
Yeah, I think
Go
that's
ahead,
right. At least in Indian country, a lot of tribes who obviously you already have tribes that are engaged in coal development. There is some overlap there just because tribes are so constrained to a specific set of land. So either they kind of have clean energy options or they don't. But there is some overlay in a couple of tribes, and some of those tribes have started diversification and looking at these questions. A lot of it has started internally with kind of intra-tribal projects, just because those tribes happen to be really far away from large population centers. So like, for example, I'm thinking of the tribes that are right off of the eastern slope of the Rockies, have great wind energy potential. I think outside of the offshore locations, they have the highest in the country, but it's those transmission lines and siting that just become such a rub in terms of really developing those clean energy resources. So a lot of it's been small scale. But for a lot of folks in Indian country, either you have the renewable or you don't, if that makes sense. So it's not as much of a opportunity for tribes everywhere.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, I'm thinking about my sort of limited knowledge of natural gas and livelihoods. And my reaction to that has been, you see a lot of the same inequities as you've seen in coal. And so I would say what the conversation we're having about coal is probably pretty similar for all fossil fuels, and in large part drives the conversation on why a lot of us want to talk about equity in renewable energy development. Kind of getting on at the fact that, hey, just because it's reduced emissions doesn't mean it's fair. And so I would say all energy production, all energy consumption requires these conversations, and I'm not sure that there's a consensus around a set of answers for any of them at this point.
All right, well, on that note, we are running out of time. So again, this has been so wonderful to hear from you two. Thank you again so much for not only your essay, all of the time and commitment that you have given the ELJ and for today. And I know that you both are working on projects related to this. So we look forward to some future works from both of you. And I do want to say that one of the goals that you both stated in the essay was to prompt in-depth contributions from authors in future editions of the journal. So we welcome the audience to take that to heart and reach out to Harvey and me if you would like to write on the subject. And thank you all for tuning in.